Let me start with something structural. Imagine you're an engineer, and you've been hired to defend a bridge. You've got surface-to-air guns on the bridge itself. You've got radar on the towers. You've got soldiers at both ends. You've built what you believe to be an impenetrable cordon around the most important piece of infrastructure you own. Now imagine your enemy doesn't attack the bridge. They attack the fuel depot that powers the generators that run your radar. They attack the road that brings ammunition to your guns. They attack the barracks 20 miles back where your replacement soldiers sleep. They attack, systematically and methodically, every node in the supply web that keeps your bridge defense operational. By the time they get to the bridge itself, it isn't defended anymore. It's just sitting there. That is the precise strategic logic behind what Ukraine executed on April 16, 2026. And over the next 20 minutes, we are going to walk through it, not as a military highlight reel, but as a strategic architecture. Because what happened that night was not a random barrage. It was the culmination of a doctrine that has been building for over a year. And it changes the fundamental calculus of this war in ways that the headlines have not fully captured. We're going to look at 4 receipts, 4 documented, verifiable strategic realities that explain why April 16th happened, why it worked, and why Russia has no answer to it. Then we're going to follow the consequences, economically, politically, and inside Russia itself. And we're going to close with 3 scenarios for where this goes from here. Let's begin. Here is the strategic problem Ukraine lived with for most of this war. And understanding it is essential to understanding why April 16th represents something genuinely new. Ukraine developed short-range FPV drones early in the conflict. These became the defining weapon of frontline combat, cheap, fast, lethal, and manufacturable at scale. They transformed ground warfare in a way that military theorists will study for decades. A drone-infested kill zone extending up to 50 kilometers beyond the front line turned every Russian infantry advance into a transit through a mechanized abattoir. Ukraine also developed long-range strike drones. These extended the war into Russian territory itself, hitting oil refineries in the Urals, airfields near Moscow, ammunition depots hundreds of miles from the front. The strategic value was psychological as much as kinetic. The war was no longer safely distant for Russian civilians. But between those 2 capabilities, the short-range frontline weapon and the long-range deep strike, there was a gap, a no-man's land of distances from roughly 20 to 300 kilometers. Targets in the occupied regions, command posts, logistics hubs, air defense installations, fuel storage, troop staging areas. These were too far for the FPV drones and too close and too numerous to justify the expense of long-range strategic assets. Russia understood this gap. It deliberately positioned its most valuable rear area infrastructure within it. Air defense batteries protecting the occupied territories. Iskander missile launch bases in Crimea, positioned to fire into Ukraine with a degree of operational impunity. Fuel depots and ammunition stores well behind the forward edge of the battle area. The calculation was, Ukraine can't reach us here, so this is where we'll put the things we need to sustain the offensive. That calculation is now obsolete. The Atlantic Council documents that Ukraine began a concerted effort to fill this gap in early 2025, developing a mid-range drone capability optimized for targets in exactly that 20 to 300 kilometer envelope. The drones are cheaper than their long-range counterparts, purpose-built for the relevant target set, and manufacturable in sufficient volume to sustain a continuous campaign. Between March 2025 and March 2026, Ukraine conducted 365 mid-range strikes, 1 per day, every day, for a year. Half of those strikes targeted Russian air defense systems in the occupied regions. This was not random. This was a deliberate, patient deconstruction of the defensive architecture that Russia had built around the infrastructure it thought was safe. April 16th was what that year of preparation made possible. That is receipt number one. Ukraine identified a strategic gap, spent a year building the capability to fill it, and on April 16th deployed that capability at scale. The 16 targets struck that night were not opportunistic. They were the harvest of a 12-month investment in systematic air defense suppression. Let's talk about how Ukraine's targeting logic actually works, because it is more sophisticated than standard strike planning, and it explains the sequencing of what we saw on April 16th. Air defense systems do not exist in isolation. They are nodes in an ecosystem. A Pantsir S-1 battery in Feodosia doesn't just protect itself, it protects everything within its engagement envelope. An OSA AK system in Vodiane covers a corridor of airspace that Russia's logistics convoys depend on. A Buk M1 in Bahativka protects a cluster of targets that Russia needs to sustain operations in Zaporizhia. When Ukraine destroys an air defense node, it doesn't just remove one weapon from Russia's inventory. It opens a corridor, a lane of airspace that is now undefended, through which subsequent strikes can be conducted against whatever that air defense system was protecting. Every air defense kill is simultaneously a key to the next target. This is why half of Ukraine's mid-range strikes over the past year targeted air defense systems. Ukraine wasn't playing defense against Russian air assets. It was methodically unlocking the target set it intended to destroy in the subsequent phase of the campaign. On April 16th, we can see this logic operating in real time across three separate geographic areas simultaneously. In Donetsk, an OSA AK system in Vodiane went down. That system had been protecting the logistical corridor that Russia's spring offensive depends upon. The drones that followed went deep into that corridor, striking convoys, armored vehicles, troop concentrations, and the supply lines that were now exposed. In Crimea, Iskander missile launch bases lost their protective air defense cover. Ukraine then struck those bases directly, degrading Russia's ability to launch the ballistic missile salvos that have been among its most destructive tools against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. The calculus is straightforward. It is strategically preferable to destroy a missile at its source than to expend expensive interceptors against it in flight. In Zaporizhia, a Buk M1 in Bahativka was destroyed. The pattern holds. A subsequent strike against the targets that system was guarding is now structurally enabled. The air defense kill is a promissory note for the next attack. This is what sophisticated attrition warfare looks like. Not a single dramatic blow, but a cascading sequence in which each action creates the conditions for the next. Russia built its rear area defense assuming it would face isolated attacks. It is instead facing a campaign that treats every strike as an investment in future strike capacity. That is receipt number two. Ukraine's targeting doctrine is not a list of high-value targets. It is an ecosystem map. Destroy the shield, then take the sword. Every air defense kill is a key to the next door. Now let's talk about oil. Because what Ukraine hit on April 16th, and in the days that followed, wasn't just military hardware. It was Russia's fuel infrastructure. And understanding why that matters requires stepping back from the battlefield and looking at the war's economic architecture. Russia's war machine runs on fuel, not metaphorically, literally. Every armored vehicle in the Donetsk offensive requires diesel. Every Iskander launch requires fuel for the transporter erector launcher. Every logistics convoy, every troop shuttle, every air sortie burns fuel that has to come from somewhere. And that fuel, for Russian forces in the occupied territories, comes through a network of depots and distribution points that Ukraine has now identified as a priority target set. On April 16th, Ukraine struck oil depots at Rubicon and Tuapse in Crimea. 2 days later, a depot in Sevastopol, the former home port of the Black Sea Fleet, was struck. These are not isolated tactical hits. They are part of a sustained campaign to deny Russia the fuel logistics that sustain its forward operations. But the implications extend beyond the battlefield. The Tuapse refinery strike, conducted in Krasnodar Krai on April 16th, illustrates the strategic depth of this energy campaign. This is one of the 10 largest refineries in Russia. It processes 12 million tons of oil products annually and accounts for up to 10% of Russia's total petroleum exports. The Kremlin's regional governor offered the standard explanation: drone debris caused the fire. This claim requires accepting that the most precisely navigating debris in the recorded history of industrial accidents found its way specifically to fuel storage tanks at a strategic refinery. The refinery was struck. The fires were visible from the Black Sea. The economic impact is real. Here is the broader economic logic. Russia's war budget is financed substantially by hydrocarbon export revenue. Sanctions have redirected that revenue from Western buyers to Chinese and Indian intermediaries. But the revenue flow is structurally dependent on export infrastructure: ports, pipelines, refineries, storage terminals. Ukraine has been attacking that infrastructure systematically. Refineries in the Urals, Baltic port facilities, now Crimean depots, and the Tuapse refinery. Each strike reduces throughput. Reduced throughput means reduced export volume. Reduced export volume means reduced revenue. Reduced revenue means harder choices about what gets funded: the pension system, the defense budget, or the private military infrastructure that keeps the front line operational. These are not abstract connections. They are the fiscal mechanics of a war economy under sustained attack. Ukraine has also disrupted the Baltic infrastructure. Reports from the same week confirm attacks against the Vysotsk port in the Leningrad region. Combined with the Crimean depot strikes, this creates a picture of a coordinated campaign against Russia's ability to move petroleum products from production to export. This is classic strategic interdiction. You don't just hit the army, you hit the economic system that sustains the army. The Wehrmacht's collapse in 1944 was accelerated not primarily by ground combat, but by the Allied air campaign against German fuel production. Ukraine appears to have internalized this lesson and is applying it with the tools available to it. That is receipt number 3. The energy campaign is not opportunistic. It is a systematic attack on the fiscal and logistical spine of Russia's war economy, from the battlefield fuel depot to the strategic export refinery. Let's talk about what Ukraine built on April 16th, in addition to what it destroyed. 2 institutional developments from that day deserve attention because they tell us something about the trajectory of this campaign over the next 6 to 12 months. The first is the destruction of the Rubicon drone facility in Hirne. Rubicon is not just any Russian drone unit. It was created specifically to develop Russia's own advanced drone capability, to do what Ukraine has already done, which is to build a drone warfare doctrine from first principles that can compete with the FPV and medium-range capabilities Ukraine has demonstrated. It represents Russia's attempt to catch up to Ukraine in the domain where Ukraine has been most dominant. Ukraine's strike against Rubicon's drone depot and workshop is therefore not just a tactical hit against a military facility. It is a direct attack on Russia's capacity to close the drone warfare gap. Every piece of equipment destroyed in that facility, every technician displaced, every development timeline disrupted, is a delay in Russia's ability to replicate what Ukraine has built. This is the second-order logic that makes the strike strategically significant beyond its immediate kinetic effects. Ukraine is not just fighting the current war, it is shaping the conditions of the war 6 months from now, ensuring that the asymmetric drone advantage it currently holds is not eroded by Russian institutional catch-up. The second development is what Ukraine built for itself. Commander Robert Brovdy of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces confirmed the establishment of a new deep strike center within that command. Its stated purpose is to integrate long-range operations against high-value targets, providing a unified coordination architecture for exactly the kind of multi-unit, multi-theater, simultaneous strike operation that April 16th represented. This matters because coordination is the limiting factor in complex strike operations. Individual units can develop drone capability. What is harder is synchronizing 16 strikes across Donetsk, Crimea, Zaporizhia, and Krasnodar Krai in a single operational window, deconflicting the targeting, sequencing the air defense kills before the follow-on strikes, and exploiting the corridors opened by each preceding hit. The Deep Strike Center is the institutional answer to that coordination problem. Its creation suggests that April 16th was not a one-time demonstration of what Ukraine can do. It was a capability baseline, the first full operational deployment of a command architecture designed to sustain and scale this kind of campaign. That is receipt number 4. Ukraine simultaneously degraded Russia's capacity to develop its own drone doctrine while establishing the institutional infrastructure to accelerate its own. The gap between the two sides in this domain is not narrowing. It is widening. Let's step back from the operational level and ask the fundamental question. What does this campaign mean for the war's political endpoint? Wars end in one of 3 ways. Military collapse. One side's army ceases to function as a coherent fighting force. Economic exhaustion. The resource base required to sustain the war becomes unavailable. Political fracture. The domestic political consensus that enables the war dissolves. Ukraine's medium-range campaign is designed to accelerate all 3 simultaneously, and it is worth examining each in turn. On the military dimension, the kill zone expansion is the critical development. Early in 2025, Russian troops had to navigate drone-infested terrain up to 50 kilometers behind the front line just to reach their assault positions. With medium-range drones now extending that envelope to 150 kilometers, the operational concept of the Russian spring offensive has been disrupted at its source. Troop concentrations that would have been safe staging areas are now target-rich environments. Logistics convoys that were beyond drone range are now being struck on their routes. The spring offensive is not just being resisted at the front, it is being attenuated in the rear. The numbers reflect this. Russia is losing 316 soldiers per square kilometer of Donetsk it captures. That ratio, already unsustainable by historical standards of attritional warfare, will increase as the kill zone expands. More of Russia's soldiers are dying further from the front, in locations that were supposed to be safe, in encounters that were supposed to be impossible. On the economic dimension, the fuel infrastructure campaign is the mechanism. Russia's war budget is under pressure from multiple directions. Sanctions reduced export revenue, the cost of continuous munitions expenditure, the wage premiums required to recruit soldiers into an increasingly lethal war, and the fiscal burden of supporting the families of the dead. Each refinery strike, each depot destroyed, each port disrupted reduces the export revenue available to offset those costs. On the political dimension, and this is perhaps the most consequential development, Russian state-owned polling data is beginning to show cracks. The All-Russian Public Opinion Research Center, which has every institutional incentive to report the most favorable numbers possible to the Kremlin, recorded 6 consecutive weeks of declining approval ratings for Putin. The numbers moved from 72.9% to 66.7% between early March and early April. That is a 6-point drop in 6 weeks from a polling apparatus that is designed to minimize negative readings. What that means in practical terms is that the true decline is almost certainly steeper. State polling agencies in authoritarian systems function as floors, not ceilings, for public sentiment measurement. If the massage number is dropping at that rate, the underlying reality is worse, and it will get worse still as the Tuapse refinery fire, visible from the Black Sea in a region with a large civilian population, processes through the Russian information environment over the coming days and weeks. This is the strategic genius of Ukraine's campaign architecture. It is not designed simply to win battles. It is designed to make the war progressively harder for Russia to sustain politically. Every military failure feeds the casualty list. Every casualty feeds the polling decline. Every polling decline increases the pressure on the Kremlin to find an exit. But Putin's exit options are constrained by the maximalist position he has staked out publicly. Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Crimea as Russian territory permanently and irrevocably. Retreating from that position requires him to explain to the Russian people why 600,000 casualties, a conservative estimate at this point, were worth something less than what he promised. That is the trap Ukraine is building. Not a military encirclement, but a political one. Make the cost of continuing unbearable while making the cost of stopping for Putin personally equally unbearable. And then wait. Let's close with the future. The April 16th campaign opens three divergent paths, and they lead to very different outcomes. Scenario 1. Escalation to equilibrium. The grinding transition. In this scenario, Russia absorbs the medium-range campaign and adapts. It disperses its rear-area assets more aggressively, improves its drone interception capabilities, and accelerates its own unmanned systems development, albeit from a position of capability deficit after the Rubicon strike. The front lines stabilize in a condition of mutual attrition at a slightly lower intensity. This is the path of least dramatic change. Ukraine retains its drone advantage but cannot convert it into decisive territorial gains. Russia retains enough combat power to prevent a collapse, but cannot convert its numerical superiority into meaningful advances. The war continues at a lower temperature, with Ukraine's strikes making the economic and human cost increasingly visible inside Russia, and the domestic political pressure on Putin building slowly rather than acutely. The implication of this scenario for the international system is a prolonged drain on European security resources, continued uncertainty in energy markets, and an extended period of Russian institutional deterioration that eventually produces a leadership transition, though the timeline for that transition is measured in years, not months. Scenario 2. Strategic acceleration. The cascade. In this scenario, the medium-range campaign produces compounding effects that exceed Ukraine's base projections. The air defense suppression campaign reaches a threshold point at which the gaps in Russia's defensive coverage become too large to patch with available assets. The kill zone expansion makes the spring offensive tactically non-viable, producing a Russian withdrawal from contested positions that had been held at enormous cost. The polling decline accelerates, reaching a point at which elite defection becomes a rational calculation for actors inside the Russian system. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a cascade, a series of interconnected failures that each make the next more likely. The operational failure feeds the political crisis. The political crisis reduces the quality of operational decision-making. The reduced decision-making quality produces more operational failures. Ukraine has engineered exactly the structural conditions that make this cascade possible. Whether it actualizes depends on factors that are not fully within Ukraine's control. The resilience of Russia's domestic political institutions, the pace of Chinese economic support, the cohesion of Western supply chains. But the mechanism is in place. Scenario 3. Russian escalation, the desperate swing. The third scenario is the one that carries the highest immediate risk. Facing compounding failures on the battlefield, economic degradation from the infrastructure campaign, and a polling decline that is beginning to threaten the political consensus around the war, the Kremlin makes the decision to escalate beyond the current conflict envelope. This could take several forms. A more aggressive campaign of missile strikes against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, designed to impose sufficient civilian suffering to fracture Ukraine's political will. An expansion of the conflict's geographic scope, including provocations against NATO's eastern flank designed to complicate Western support. Or, in the most extreme version, the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, which Putin has periodically invoked as a rhetorical instrument and which some analysts assess as a genuine option under conditions of acute military failure. The nuclear escalation pathway is the one that the NATO alliance's deterrence architecture is specifically designed to prevent. The credibility of that deterrence and Ukraine's continued ability to receive Western military and economic support is therefore the critical external variable in constraining this scenario. What is clear is that the conditions that make Scenario 3 more likely are precisely the conditions that Scenarios 1 and 2 are designed to create. A Russian leadership under acute pressure, with diminishing options and a historical pattern of responding to strategic failure with escalatory action rather than strategic reassessment. The management of that risk is not Ukraine's problem to solve alone. It is the central challenge for Western policymakers over the next 12 to 24 months. Let me return to where we started. The bridge is undefended. Not because Ukraine attacked the bridge, because Ukraine spent a year attacking the fuel depot, the ammunition route, the replacement barracks, the radar generators. Everything that made the bridge defense possible was systematically dismantled before Ukraine ever pointed a drone at the bridge itself. What we saw on April 16th is the proof of concept for a doctrine that has been quietly maturing for 12 months. One medium-range strike per day, every day, for a year. Half of them targeting air defense systems, opening corridors for the strikes that followed. A new institutional architecture for coordinating complex, multi-theater operations. An energy campaign designed to degrade Russia's war economy from the production facility to the battlefield fuel depot. Russia built its rear area defense on the assumption that it was safe. That assumption is no longer operational. The kill zones have tripled. The targets that were supposed to be out of reach are burning. And Ukraine has not reached the ceiling of this capability. According to its own commanders, April 16th was the escalation of a campaign that is still in its growth phase. The polling numbers inside Russia tell us that the population is beginning to process what this means. 6 consecutive weeks of declining approval ratings from a polling apparatus that is structurally biased toward positive numbers. The Tuapse refinery burning on the horizon. The Black Sea Fleet, once Russia's naval instrument of power, reduced to a fleet without a port, losing fuel and ammunition to drones. Putin wanted a maximalist victory. He will settle, if he settles at all, for something much less. The question is whether he can reach that conclusion before the political arithmetic inside Russia forces a conclusion upon him. Ukraine is not waiting for the answer. It has more strikes coming. The engines are warming up. Stay informed. Think structurally. Follow the doctrine, not just the headlines.